The morning they told me my daughter was going to die, the sky outside the hospital window was impossibly blue. Not the kind of blue that feels like warning, not gray and heavy with the weight of bad news. It was the kind of blue that exists in postcards and screensavers and children's drawings, bright, clear, and different. And I remember standing at that window, watching a sparrow land on a wire 3 floors below, thinking that the world was moving along just fine without knowing that everything inside that room had just stopped. Her name was Lily Grace Calloway. She was 7 years old, and she had a laugh that sounded like someone had bottled the feeling of the last day of school before summer. She laughed with her whole body, threw her head back, grabbed your arm, like joy was something she had to hold on to keep from floating away. She had strawberry blonde hair that never stayed in a ponytail for more than 20 minutes, and green eyes that she got from her grandmother on my side. Eyes so green they looked almost fictional, like something an artist might invent. She collected rocks. Not gemstones, not anything valuable. Just ordinary rocks she found on sidewalks and parks, and once in the parking lot of a grocery store. Rocks she carried home in her coat pockets and lined up on her windowsill like they were trophies. She named them, every single one. I need you to understand who she was before I tell you what happened, because this story is not really about death. I know it might seem like it is, but it isn't. This story is about what one small child with one quiet, simple request did to an entire city without even knowing she was doing it. And I need you to feel the weight of who she was first, before you can feel the full weight of what came after. My name is Daniel Calloway. I was 34 years old when all of this began. I worked as an electrician, commercial buildings mostly, the kind of work where you spend a lot of time in ceilings and wall cavities and places nobody ever sees. My wife, Renata, she was a kindergarten teacher. We lived in a mid-sized city in the middle of the country, the kind of place where everybody knows someone who knows you, where the hardware store still has a counter where you can chat for 10 minutes before they ring you up. Not small enough to feel claustrophobic, not big enough to feel anonymous. Cedar Falls, Iowa, population just under 40,000, though it felt bigger in the ways that mattered and smaller in the ways that helped. Lily was our only child. We had tried for 3 years before she came, and by the time she arrived, we were the kind of parents who understood, in our bones, what it meant to want something and not have it. So we maybe loved her a little harder than most, not smothering, not hovering, just deeply, intentionally, like every ordinary Tuesday with her was a gift we hadn't forgotten to be grateful for. She got sick in March. It started with what we thought was a bad cold, then fatigue that wouldn't lift, then bruises. Too many of them in places that didn't make sense. The back of her knee, her shoulder blade, the side of her neck, pale yellow and spreading like watercolors. We took her to the pediatrician, who sent us to a specialist, who ordered blood work, who called us back, and 3 days later, with that particular tone in his voice that parents learn to fear, that slow, careful, too gentle voice that means the thing about to be said cannot be unsaid. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, all. The most common childhood cancer, which they told us as if that should be comforting, as if being the most common version of a terrible thing made it somehow less terrible. She was 7 years old, and something inside her blood was trying to destroy her from the inside. They said the prognosis was good. That phrase, good prognosis, it became both a lifeline and a kind of cruelty over the months that followed, because good didn't mean certain, and we learned that quickly. Good meant there is a path forward. Good meant treatment. Good meant suffering, the kind that piles up in hospital hallways and waiting rooms, and the spaces between 2:30 in the morning and 3. When sleep won't come and the mind goes to places you spend your daylight hours trying to keep it from. We started chemotherapy in April. Lily handled it with a grace that I can only describe as humbling. There were days when she was sick, genuinely, terribly sick, and she would lie on her side in the hospital bed and ask me to tell her about the stars, not just the names, the stories. She had become obsessed with constellations sometime in the second month of treatment, something she picked up from a book the hospital library cart brought around. She wanted to know not just where Orion was in the sky, but why he was there, what he had done, who he had loved, what had happened to him in the end. And I would sit beside her bed in that particular fluorescent quiet of a children's oncology ward and tell her, making up parts I didn't know, weaving the real mythology together with whatever felt right. And she would listen with her eyes half closed, her hand in mine, and sometimes she would smile at the parts where love was involved. And sometimes she would ask if the gods were sad about the things they couldn't fix. I didn't always have good answers for that one. By summer, we thought we were winning. The numbers were moving in the right direction. The oncologist, Dr. Margaret Assay, a woman with the kind of steady calm that must take decades to build, told us the initial response was encouraging. Lily went home for 8 weeks. We took her to a lake. She swam. She laughed. She found 11 rocks in the first afternoon and named them all after planets, plus one she called after the lake itself, which she named Waverly because she said that sounded like the sound water makes. I think about those 8 weeks a lot. I think about the way the lake light fell on her face in the evenings. I think about how she tasted a s'more for the first time that summer, how her eyes went wide, how she said it tasted like the universe had made a decision to be kind. I held on to all of it the way you hold on to something you sense might be temporary, even when you're trying not to sense that. We came back to the hospital in September. The cancer had returned. It had found a way around the treatment, mutated, regrouped, come back harder and angrier than before. Dr. Assay sat with us in a small consultation room with a box of tissues on the table between us, and she told us with steady eyes and a voice that barely trembled that Lily's options had narrowed significantly. There was a second-line treatment. There was a possibility of a bone marrow transplant if we could find a match. There were clinical trials. She outlined every path with precision and care, and Renata held my hand so hard my knuckles went white, and I sat there understanding every word and somehow not processing any of them. What she was telling us, gently, carefully, with every shred of her professional compassion, was that the likelihood of long-term survival had dropped from good to uncertain. From uncertain towards something darker that she didn't name directly, but that lived in the space between her words. The second round of treatment hit Lily harder. She lost her hair completely this time, something that had only been partial the first time around. She was quiet about it. When we sat with her the morning after it happened, when there was barely anything left, she ran her own hand over her head slowly, feeling the unfamiliar smoothness. And then she looked up at us with those green eyes and said she thought she looked like a baby bird. She said baby birds were brave because they had to trust the nest even when they didn't know how to fly yet. She was 7 years old, 7, and she said that. There are moments with children that stop time, that reorder the way you understand the world. That was one of mine. October came and the treatments were taking more from her than they were returning. She spent more days confined to bed. She tired easily. The easy, full-body laugh was still there, but it came less often and lasted shorter, like a radio signal fading in and out. She still asked about the stars. She still lined up her rocks on the hospital windowsill, and the nurses learned their names and called them by those names when they cleaned around them, which made Lily smile every single time. She had favorites among the nurses. There was a young man named Marcus, 20s, always had a different colored pair of sneakers, who would stop by after his shift sometimes just to show her the new ones. There was a nurse named Diane, mid-50s, who had been doing this work for 30 years and still cried in the break room sometimes, who used to bring Lily animal crackers and sit with her and let her talk about whatever was on her mind without redirecting toward medicine or facts or updates. And there was a weekend nurse named Phoebe, barely older than a college student, who had learned the names of all 11 rocks within her first week on Lily's floor and would greet them by name every morning like old friends. These people became our world, the way a hospital does when you live inside one long enough. You stop seeing the fluorescent lights. You stop smelling the antiseptic. You start to see the people, the real people moving through it, the ones who chose this work, knowing exactly what it was going to cost them. In the second week of November, Dr. Asay came in with a different quality of quietness about her. Not the focused, data-driven quietness of a doctor processing information. This was something older, something heavier. She had run every test again. She had consulted with 2 other specialists. She had reviewed everything. The bone marrow transplant was not going to happen. They had found no viable match in time, and Lily's condition had progressed to a point where the transplant itself would present a danger greater than it might address. The clinical trial she had hoped might qualify for had enrollment criteria Lily couldn't meet. The second-line treatment was not producing the response they needed. She told us, and I watched Renata beside me absorb it, the way a person absorbs something physical, the way the body takes impact, and I felt something in me go very still, not numb. Too awake to be numb, just still, like the moment between lightning and thunder when the world holds its breath. Lily was not going to recover. They could keep her comfortable. They could manage her pain. They could give her the best possible quality of the time that remained, which Dr. Asay estimated carefully, gently, in the language of medicine that tries to be human, was likely measured in weeks rather than months. We didn't tell Lily that night. We sat with her and watched a movie about talking animals on the hospital's little screen, and she fell asleep halfway through, and Renata and I sat on either side of her in the dark of that room and didn't say anything to each other for a long time. What was there to say? Some things are too large for language. Some grief is beyond the reach of words and sits in the chest like a stone, and you carry it because there is nothing else to do. We told her the next morning. We had debated it, argued about it, cried about it. Whether to tell a 7-year-old the truth, whether the kindness of knowing outweighed the kindness of not knowing. In the end, it was Renata who said, she knows us. She will read it in our faces if we don't tell her. And she deserves to be seen clearly, not managed. And she was right. That was the right call. Lily deserved the truth wrapped in love, not the truth hidden behind performance. We sat on either side of her bed, and we told her as simply and as gently as we could that the medicine was having trouble fighting her sickness, that her body was very tired, that the doctors had done everything they knew how to do, that we didn't know how much time she had left, but that we wanted to spend every moment of it with her, doing whatever she wanted to do, being wherever she wanted to be. She was quiet for a while. She looked at her rocks on the windowsill. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at her own hands. Then she looked at us and said she wasn't scared. She said she thought maybe dying was like going somewhere the stars are closer. And then, after another long quiet, she said she had a request. Not a wish. She didn't call it a wish. She called it a request. And when I asked her what she meant, she said she wanted to think about it for a day before she told us, to make sure she was sure. I don't think I slept that night. The next morning, when Renata and I came in with coffee and the particular hollow eyes of people who have kept themselves going on hope and stubbornness, Lily was already awake. She was sitting up in her bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at us with those green eyes, and she said she was ready to tell us her request. She wanted to see a parade. Not go to a parade. She clarified this. She wasn't asking to be taken somewhere. She was tired and she understood she couldn't travel far, and she didn't want to fuss about transportation and logistics. What she wanted was for a parade to come to her. Specifically, she wanted a parade to go past the hospital, past her window on the 3rd floor, facing Main Street. She wanted to sit at her window, the one where her rocks lived, and watch a parade go by below. She said she had never seen a parade up close. We had taken her to one when she was 4, but she had been too small to see over the crowd and had spent most of it sitting on my shoulders. And she said it didn't really count because she wanted to see it at eye level, where you could see the faces of the people in it. She said she wanted to see their faces. That was the part she kept coming back to. Not the floats, not the music, not any particular thing. She wanted to see the faces of people who were happy to be there. That was all. A parade passed the hospital window, so she could see the faces of happy people. I looked at Renata. Renata looked at me. She was dying. Our daughter was dying, and she had one request, and it was this. I want you to think for a moment about how a person receives that, about the particular tenderness and pain of having a child ask for something so small, so utterly reasonable and simultaneously impossible in the context of mid-November in a city where no parade was scheduled for weeks. There was no Christmas parade until December 15th. Thanksgiving was still 2.5 weeks away. There was nothing on the city calendar anywhere near the window of time Dr. Assay had given us. I went into the hallway while Renata stayed with Lily, and I stood with my back against the wall, and I pressed my fists against my eyes because I could not, in that hallway, fall apart. And then I took 3 slow breaths and pulled out my phone and started making calls. The first call was to the city's Parks and Recreation Department, where a very kind woman named Sandra listened to everything I said and then said she was so very sorry, and that a spontaneous parade required permits and coordination in a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks for even the most basic of approvals, and that she didn't see a way to make it happen in the time frame involved. She said she was sorry again. She sounded like she meant it. The second call was to the local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Courier, where I left a message with a reporter I'd met once at a neighborhood thing. I didn't know if he'd call back. I didn't know what I was hoping for. I was reaching in every direction I could think of. The third call was to my brother Kevin, who was also my best friend, and the person I called when I didn't know what else to do. He answered on the second ring and listened to everything without interrupting, and when I was done, he said, "Give me 24 hours." And I said I might not have 24 hours to give. And he said, "Give me what you have." I went back into Lily's room, and we spent the rest of that day the way we had learned to spend days in the hospital, telling stories and watching television and looking at her rocks and having a kind of ordinary love that felt sacred because of everything pressing in around it. That night, Kevin posted in a local Facebook group. It was a simple post. I didn't see it until after it had been up for 6 hours, and by then it had been shared close to 400 times. He had written a short paragraph about Lily, about her diagnosis, about her request, about the window on the 3rd floor of Cedar Falls Medical Center facing Main Street, about a little girl who had never asked for anything except to see the faces of happy people from her window. He had not used manipulative language. He had not exaggerated. He had just told the truth because the truth was already everything. By midnight, the post had been shared over 800 times. By 3 a.m, it had crossed 2,000. By the time I woke up the next morning, Kevin was calling me. And the first thing he said when I picked up was, Danny, you need to look at your phone." The notifications were beyond counting, but it wasn't the notifications that mattered. What mattered were the messages. Dozens of them from people I didn't know, and then dozens more, and they were all saying the same basic thing in different words. They were saying they were coming. They were asking when, They were asking what to wear. They were asking if they could bring anything. They were organizing among themselves in the comments, strangers talking to strangers, figuring out logistics. Someone saying, I have a truck, I can decorate. Someone else saying, my daughter's dance studio can be there by 10. Someone else saying, I used to play trumpet in the high school band, and I still have it if anyone wants music. The reporter from the Courier, a man named Elliot Torres, called me at 8 in the morning. He had seen Kevin's post. He had been up since 4, he said, because the story had started moving onto other platforms, and he didn't want to be behind it. He asked if he could come to the hospital and meet Lily and the family. I said yes. He showed up with a quiet, gentle gravity that told me he understood what he was walking into. And he sat with Lily for 40 minutes while she told him about her rocks and about constellations. And he wrote everything down in a small notebook with careful, slow handwriting. His article went up that afternoon. It was not a long article. Elliot was not a flowery writer. He wrote the way Lily lived, with clarity and no excess. He described her request in 2 sentences. He described the post and the response in 3 more. He ended the article with a single quote from Lily, the only direct quote in the whole piece, and she had said it herself when he asked what she hoped to see from her window. She had said, I just want to see the faces of people who are glad to be alive. The article was shared 20,000 times in the first 12 hours. By the next morning, Cedar Falls was not the only place talking about Lily Calloway. The Cedar Falls Courier article had been picked up by regional news aggregators and then by national ones. And by the time I walked into the hospital that second morning, Marcus, the sneaker nurse, met me at the elevator with his phone in his hand, showing me a tweet from a reporter in Chicago who had reposted the article. By 10 that morning, 2 television stations had contacted the hospital's communications office requesting permission to cover the story. The city manager of Cedar Falls, a woman named Patricia Hearn, who I had voted for twice and never personally interacted with, had called the hospital administrator directly to say the city was ready to assist in whatever way was needed. It was building. I need you to understand what this felt like from where I was standing, because it would be easy to describe it as wonderful and leave it at that, but the reality was more complex than wonderful. It was wonderful, and it was terrifying, and it was also breaking me open in ways I hadn't expected. Because every new person who shared the post, every new organization that reached out, every new message of support was also another reminder of what we were doing this for. Every act of kindness was shaped around the fact that my daughter was dying. And there were moments in those days when I had to step back from my phone and breathe, because gratitude and grief were occupying the same space inside my chest, and I didn't always know which one was going to win on any given breath. Lily didn't know yet how big it was becoming. We had told her that people were organizing, that there might be a parade, that we were working on it. She had nodded with the patience of someone who had learned to trust that the things you wait for are worth waiting for. And she had gone back to naming the newest rock she'd found, a piece of quartz one of the nurses had brought her from home, which she named Elliot after the reporter. The permits came through on the 3rd day. I don't know entirely how. Kevin told me later that Patricia Hearn had personally expedited them, citing a municipal emergency provision that was designed for natural disasters, but that she had determined could be applied here by expanding the definition of what a community emergency meant. He said her exact words to the permits office were, "A child is asking to see the faces of her neighbors before she dies. I'm calling this an emergency. Get it done." And they did. The parade was set for Saturday, 6 days after Lily had made her request. I'm going to try to describe to you what happened in those 6 days, but I want to be honest that my memory of them is not linear. I was present in the hospital almost constantly. I was running on coffee and adrenaline, and the particular energy that comes when grief and love and purpose are all pointing in the same direction. Renata was steadier than I was in most moments. She had this quality of centeredness under pressure that I had always admired in her, and she channeled it into being the person Lily needed in those days, present and warm and unfrightened, or at least unfrightened on the outside, which is sometimes the most loving thing a person can do. Lily was declining, slowly but measurably. Dr. Asay was adjusting her medications for comfort. There were days when she slept more than she was awake. There were days when the pain was there and you could see it in the set of her jaw. And the nurses managed it with the care of people who took the management of pain as seriously as any other medical act. There were good days too, genuinely good ones, where she was alert and present and funny. She had a dry wit that you didn't expect from a 7-year-old, a way of delivering an observation with perfect timing that would make the room laugh. Those days felt like gifts. The whole week felt like gifts wrapped in something hard to hold. The response to the parade kept growing. A high school marching band from across the city was coming. A dance academy with 3 different age groups had choreographed a short piece specifically for the event and had been practicing every evening. A veterans group was coming in uniform. A local fire department had offered 2 trucks. A church choir of 60 people was coming to sing. A costume shop had organized a group dressed as fairy tale characters because someone in the planning had found out that Lily liked fairy tales, which she did, though she preferred the versions where the endings were complicated and real. A local bakery was making 100 little bags of cookies to hand out to the crowd. A florist was donating the flowers for 3 decorated vehicles. A father of 3 who had no connection to anyone involved simply showed up at the hospital on Thursday with a homemade banner he had, made in his garage, that said in large, careful letters, "We see you, Lily." I cried when I saw that banner. I was in the lobby when his wife brought it in, not even him. He had to work, but his wife brought it. A woman I had never met, and she handed it to Marcus, who had come down to receive it. And I was walking through the lobby and I saw it, and I had to sit down on one of the plastic chairs by the window and just let the tears happen. Because here is what that banner meant in that moment to me. It wasn't just kindness. It was something more specific than kindness. It was the city saying, "We know you're there. We know what it costs to be where you are. We see the truth of it, the size of it, and we're not going to look away. We are going to come. We are going to show our faces. We are going to be the thing your daughter asked to see." Saturday came with a sky that could not decide between clouds and sun and settled on both. So the light moved in waves across the street below, bright and dimmed and bright again. The hospital staff had arranged for Lily's bed to be repositioned next to the window, and her rocks had been moved to the sill facing outward, like a row of small witnesses. She was wearing a soft lavender sweater that she had picked herself from the bag of clothes Renata had brought in. Her head was bare, and she had decided weeks ago that she was done with the hats and scarves she'd tried for a while, that she liked how the light felt on her head, and so that morning she looked clear and pale and entirely herself. Renata sat on one side of her, I sat on the other. Kevin was in the corner with his hands clasped, trying very hard not to cry, which he was failing at beautifully. Marcus was at the door. Diane had come in on her day off, and she stood against the back wall of the room with her arms crossed the way she did when she was holding herself together. Phoebe had come in early and was sitting on the floor near the windowsill, close to the rocks, which felt right. At 9:45, we heard it. Music, faint at first, then growing, the particular bright and brassy sound of a marching band warming up, coming from the direction of the street below. Lily turned toward the window slowly. She put her hand on the glass. Below us on Main Street, Cedar Falls had gathered. I don't have words sufficient for what I saw. I can try to describe it to you, and I want you to know that whatever I say, the reality was larger. The street for 3 blocks in either direction from the hospital was lined with people, hundreds of them. I found out later the estimate was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. They had come from all over the city and from surrounding towns. Some had driven for over an hour. They were holding signs, homemade ones with her name on them, with hearts, with stars, one that said, "Simply because you are loved," and one that said, "The sky is full of stars named after you." They were standing in coats and winter hats and boots, in the cold November air, and they were there. The parade began. The Cedar Falls High School marching band came first, and the sound of them filled the street and rose up to our window and filled the room. Lily pressed her face closer to the glass. I watched her eyes. I watched them move across the scene below, taking it in, processing it, and I could not tell at first what she was feeling because her face had gone very still. The band was followed by the veterans group, men and women in uniform, and they were followed by the fire trucks with their lights going, red and white lights sweeping across the building and the crowd, and behind them came the fairy tale characters from the costume shop, dressed as everyone from Cinderella to Red Riding Hood, to characters I couldn't identify, waving up at the window with both arms. The crowd was cheering. Not loudly, not in the frantic way of a sporting event. Quietly, warmly, the sound of people expressing something that was not quite celebration and not quite comfort, but somewhere in the rich. Complicated emotional territory between them. The dance academy came next. 3 groups of girls and boys ranging from maybe 6 to 16, performing on the blocked-off section of street with music playing from a portable speaker that was nowhere, near strong enough for the crowd but was plenty strong enough for the window on the 3rd floor. And Lily's hand on the glass began to move, just slightly, just the tips of her fingers, in a way that looked like she might have been dancing with them without knowing it. Then the church choir. 60 voices in the middle of Main Street on a Saturday morning in November. They sang Amazing Grace first, and then they sang a song I didn't recognize at first. Something slower and kinder, and then I realized it was a lullaby. Someone had arranged a lullaby for a 60-voice choir, and they were singing it in the street below my daughter's window. And the sound came up through the glass like it was traveling through water, transformed and immense, and Lily turned from the window and looked at me. Her face was wet. She was crying quietly, the way children cry when they're not crying about something sad, when they're crying because something beautiful has opened them up in a way they didn't know they could be opened. She said, "Daddy, they came." She said it like it was a fact she was confirming, like she hadn't entirely believed it would happen until this moment. And now that it had, she needed to name it aloud to make it fully real. I said, "They came, baby." She turned back to the window. The baker's volunteers were moving through the crowd below, handing out the little bags of cookies. The florist's decorated vehicles went past slowly, trailing ribbons and flowers that bent in the wind. And then, near the back of the parade, there was a group that had no float and no costumes and no instruments. It was just people, maybe 200 of them walking together, each of them carrying a single white candle in a holder. It was late enough in the morning that the candles weren't dramatic, weren't blazing bright against darkness. They were small and ordinary in the daylight, but they were lit, and the people carrying them were walking slowly, and some of them were looking up at the window on the 3rd floor. When they saw Lily at the glass, they raised their candles, all of them, all at once. 200 people raising a small light into the daylight sky, directed at one window, at one small girl who wanted to see the faces of people who were glad to be alive. And the crowd around them, the people who were watching, they started to clap. Slow and rhythmic and sincere, not thunderous but present, filling the street with sound that rose and found our window. Lily put both hands on the glass. She stood like that for a long time, and then she raised one hand and she waved. Below us, the crowd saw her. The cheer that went up was not controlled. It was not planned. It was the spontaneous sound of 1,500 people releasing something together. Something they hadn't known they were holding until the moment a 7-year-old girl in a lavender sweater raised her hand to a window. And the accumulated weight of her story and their love for a stranger and the ache of human beings who want so badly to matter to each other all came out at once in a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. I was not able to hold myself together. I don't think anyone in that room was. Marcus had his face in his hands. Diane had both arms wrapped around herself and was simply weeping without trying to hide it. Kevin had turned to the wall, his shoulders shaking. Renata was crying silently, her hand on Lily's back, and Phoebe was on her feet with her hands over her mouth. And I sat in the chair next to the window and let the grief and the love and the gratitude just move through me because there was nothing else to do with it. Lily watched until the last of the parade had passed. She watched the crowd dispersing slowly below, watched people talking to each other, strangers who had become momentary neighbors, watched a child no older than herself running in a circle on the sidewalk while her father tried to catch her, watched an elderly woman being helped to her car by a young man who had offered her his arm without being asked. She watched all of it, her hands on the glass, her bare head bright in the moving light. Then she turned to us and said something I have turned over and over in the years since, held it up to every kind of light to see if I could get all the way to the bottom of it. She said, "I didn't know there were that many people." I asked what she meant. She said, "I didn't know there were that many people who were glad to be alive." She said it without sadness, without irony, without the heaviness you might expect from a child who is dying and knew it. She said it the way you say the answer to a question you've been quietly holding when you finally find out and the answer is better than you feared. She was glad to know. In the week that followed, Lily received letters. Hundreds of them forwarded through the hospital, forwarded through the newspaper, sent through a P.O. box that Kevin set up after the flood of mail became impossible to manage any other way. They came from Cedar Falls and from Des Moines and from Chicago and from New York and from a woman in Scotland who had seen the story, shared on social media, and had written 2 pages about her own daughter who had survived leukemia 20 years ago and was now a grown woman who still sent her mother flowers on her birthday. Lily could not read them all. Her energy was diminishing, but Renata and Kevin and the nurses read them to her, a few at a time on the good days, and she listened with her eyes closed and sometimes smiled and sometimes simply nodded, as if each one was confirming something she was assembling in her mind piece by piece. There was one letter she asked to have read to her twice. It was from a teenage boy, 15, who lived 2 streets over from the hospital. He wrote that he had been having a very hard year, that he had been feeling invisible and disconnected, and that the day of the parade he had come down to stand in the crowd because his mom made him, and he had been annoyed about it, and then he had watched Lily wave from the window and the crowd cheer, and something had shifted in him that he said he couldn't fully explain, but that felt like realizing he was part of something. He said that before that day he had been wondering if people were fundamentally separate from each other, if the distance between people was permanent, and that after that day he thought maybe the distance was just the thing between moments of connection, that it wasn't the permanent condition but just the space you travel to get back to each other. He was 15, and he had written that. And Lily, who was 7 and had 4 days left, asked to hear it twice. She died on a Thursday. It was just past 2 in the morning. Renata and I were both with her. She had been sleeping for most of that day, deeply and peacefully, and the transition was gentle, the way Dr. Asay had promised it would be, the way the palliative team had worked carefully to ensure. There was no drama in it, no sudden crisis. There was just the slow deepening of her breathing and then a pause, and then the absence that takes up more space than you imagine. The room was quiet. Her rocks were still on the windowsill. The sparrow, the one I had watched from the window on the first terrible day, was not there. Of course, it had been months. It was a different bird, probably, but I looked at the window anyway. The sky outside was dark, with one patch of clearing in the west, where stars were visible through the hospital glass. A scattering of them, faint and cold and far away and present. I thought about what Lily had said, that maybe dying was like going somewhere the stars are closer. I chose in that moment to believe it, not because I am certain it is true, not because faith has ever come easily to me, but because my daughter had offered it to me freely, the way she offered everything, with open hands and no conditions, and the least I could do was receive it. The days after were the hardest of my life. I won't describe them in full because some things belong only to the people living them, and because the point of this story is not to catalog suffering, but to show what grows from it. I will tell you that Renata and I held each other through things that tested every structure we had built, and that we came out the other side still holding on, which is not a small thing. I will tell you that Kevin was there every day for the first month, sleeping on our couch, making us eat, doing the things that need to be done when a person's body keeps requiring maintenance, even when their spirit wants to stop. I will tell you that the nurses sent flowers, all of them, even Phoebe, who could not have afforded much on her salary, and that Marcus wore his brightest sneakers to the funeral, bright orange, and said Lily had told him once that orange was the bravest color because it was the color of fire but also of fruit, and that she would have wanted him to wear them. He was right. She would have. The parade in the months that followed became something larger than what it had been. The community, organically, without anyone really planning it, began talking about doing it again. Not as a memorial, not as a grief event, but as what Lily had actually asked for. A parade of happy faces. A parade of people being glad to be alive. Elliot Torres wrote a follow-up piece in the Courier, and in it he described what multiple people had said independently in their letters and in social media posts and in conversations at grocery stores and coffee shops. They had come to the parade for Lily, but something had happened to them when they got there. Something about standing in a crowd of strangers all pointed in the same direction, all there for the same reason, had done something to them they were struggling to name, that felt important. One woman described it as remembering something she had forgotten. A retired teacher described it as the feeling of the room understanding itself. A construction worker in his 40s, who had come alone and stood at the back and almost left twice before the choir started, wrote that he had not cried in front of other people in 15 years, and he had cried in front of 1,500 strangers on a street in November, and he felt lighter than he had since he was young. Patricia Hearn, the city manager, proposed the Lily Calloway Parade as an annual event. The vote was unanimous. The first annual parade happened the following November, on the Saturday nearest to the date of the original. Renata and I were asked if we wanted to be involved in the organizing, and we said yes, because we could not imagine saying no, because we had understood by then that Lily's request had not been only for herself, that she had, with the particular genius of children who are somehow older than their years, asked for something that turned out to be for everyone. The parade route goes past the hospital. It always goes past the hospital. They position a banner with Lily's face on the third-floor window, the window where her rocks once stood. A photograph taken by a nurse named Phoebe on the morning of the original parade. A photograph of Lily with her hands on the glass and her face turned slightly, and her eyes full of something that is not sadness, and not just happiness either, but some larger, quieter, more enduring thing. I stand in the crowd now, every year. I don't organize from the front anymore. I stand somewhere in the middle with people I know and people I don't, and I watch the faces. The way she asked to watch the faces. And I try to do what she did, which is to receive the sight of people being glad to be alive as a gift that does not require anything in return, not explanation, not apology, not the justification of suffering to make joy acceptable. Lily taught me that. In 7 years of life, with 11 rocks and a windowsill and one simple request, my daughter taught me that the capacity to be glad to be alive is not contingent on circumstances being good, that it lives underneath the circumstances, something older and more stubborn than any particular fact of a person's life, that it is possible to be dying and still be the one who shows the living how to live. Last November, the 4th annual parade, I stood in the middle of the crowd, and the weather was doing the same thing it had done that first time. Clouds and sun alternating, the light moving in waves. The marching band came by, and then the floats, and then a group of kids from the local elementary school in bright yellow rain jackets carrying paper stars they'd made in class. And somewhere near the back, a group of people carrying candles, the same as the first time, a tradition now. And when they passed the hospital window, they raised their candles, the same as before, and I looked up at the window. There was no one there. Of course there was no one there. There was the banner and Lily's photograph, and the window itself reflecting the sky. But here is the thing. And I need you to hear this clearly because this is the part that matters most. As I watched those candles rise toward the empty window, I felt something happen in the crowd around me. I felt it physically, not metaphorically, a kind of coherence, like a chord being struck on an instrument. The kind of sound that doesn't fade but opens. The kind that sits in the chest and changes the quality of breathing. The crowd was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, I heard what I can only describe as the sound of 2,000 people deciding together to be glad. I thought about what Lily had said in those last weeks more than once in different forms, that she thought maybe the point was not to outlast the hard things, but to love through them. That she thought kindness was the bravest thing because it kept going even when it had reasons to stop. That she thought the universe had made a decision to be kind, and that the job of the people in it was to agree. She was 7 years old. She had a laugh like the last day of school before summer. She named her rocks after things she loved. She asked to see the faces of people who were glad to be alive, and a whole city showed up, and they keep showing up, year after year after year. Because once you have felt what it is to stand in the street with 2,000 strangers and raise a small light toward a window in the name of a girl who only ever wanted to see your face, you don't go back to not knowing what that feels like. You carry it forward. You carry her forward, the way she carried those rocks in her coat pockets, ordinary and named and precious. Her name was Lily Grace Calloway. She was here, and the whole city saw her, and the whole city was seen, and that is still, somehow, miraculously enough.